But first, Rudy, I think we must take a moment of silence to reflect on the death of the ACC. It looks like the ACC, Florida State, and Clemson have ended their ongoing litigation Tuesday after agreeing to a settlement that changes the league's revenue distribution model and significantly reduces exit penalties for members wanting to leave the conference before 2036. Shortly after the ACC board approved the move, the board of trustees for both Florida State and Clemson approved the settlement. Shocker. The new distribution model or brand initiative will be based on a 5-year rolling average. Basically, 60% of the total ACC television revenue will go towards this initiative, which will be basically putting a lot of weight on who has seen and gotten the most viewership in the last 5 years. The remaining 40% will go to the remaining traditional members of the ACC. That would exclude SMU, Stanford, and Cal, and would be distributed evenly. A team's total viewership will then be divided by the total ACC viewership equal to its percentage of the money available in this pool. How that's going to be orchestrated, I don't know. It's going to kind of be a little weird. The settlement keeps the grant of rights in place through 2036, but beginning next year, the exit fee will be about $165 million. And then that fee will drop about 18 million each year, leveling off at about 75 million in the 2030 season. Any team that pays the exit fee can leave with its media rights intact. Television deals for the Big Ten go up in the 2030 season. The Big 12 goes up in 2030. And then the next reiteration of college football playoff comes up in 2031, along with the SEC for a renewal. So that fee will be about 75 million at that time. Previous to this agreement, it meant that paying as much as $700 million to leave the conference. So, Rudy, who won this?
I'll say college football won this.
Oh,
I think I think the teams every program kind of won here because the issue has been it's not that FSU and Clemson want to leave the ACC, it's the ability for universities and athletic programs to not feel like they're stuck at the detriment to themselves and to the detriment of their conference because their conference's leadership is just
abysmal.
subpar and accurate. So
Yeah.
uh, the winners, like FSU and Clemson, are making this like it's a big win for themselves. It's not. It's a win for everybody. So that way, it gives everybody the same chance of getting out. The only thing I find kind of funny is that yeah, they had to have that 5-year rolling average kind of put in to protect themselves because nobody cared about FSU this year and nobody cared about Clemson until the end. So I'm sure their success in the college football playoff and winning the ACC helped them at the end, but if they just did it of okay, cool, we'll just set up right now. Sorry, somebody's really excited. I guess there's an FSU fan revving their engine outside. But uh, essentially, if they started and saying, yeah, we'll do that effective this season, nobody's watching Florida State this year. So they had to do
Yeah.
something to protect themselves.
Well, I
Uh,
mean, again, I have to get my fingers in everything. So I actually ended up watching the board of trustees meeting, and they even mentioned they're like, even if you're hate watching us, it's all good. It's going to help us. And I'm like, yeah, that is technically kind of true. But I do love the
Nobody
fact
hate
that
watches Florida State though.
that's
That's
true.
the thing. People hate watch Miami. They don't
That
hate watch Florida State.
that is true. I would say I would actually pivot, take the opposite perspective of you. I think college football actually loses in this. We'll discuss a little bit further in the conversation, but I do think it actually benefits the four major programs of the ACC, which would be Clemson, FSU, Miami, and North Carolina. I think the biggest winners in all of this is Miami, only for the pure fact is that they're the only school right now that hasn't had anything leaked in terms of legal fees that they've spent looking into this. We know North Carolina spent well over, what was it, $600,000, I think it was, looking into getting out of the ACC. And then obviously millions spent by both Clemson and FSU. So the true winner is the U, as always, because now we've got our exit plan ready to go whenever that happens. Um, I will say, I think college football is the loser because I think judging by the past, conferences who have done this in terms of the splitting the revenue share and not distributing equally have all gone under or have lost the prestige of what they've once had. So that actually leads me to my next question, Rudy, is why would the ACC agree to this? What do you think was the deciding factor? Like, it seemed like for so long, the ACC had the trump card, they had the leverage in this argument by claiming this ironclad grant of rights agreement. What would make them, because I mean, when you really look at this, I mean, it gives FSU and Clemson and any other school that wants to leave basically an exit strategy. We thought it was going to be $500 million. I mean, it looked like they said 700, but realistically, I think FSU was touting somewhere in the ballpark of 500 million to leave. We're now at well under 100 million to get out. You take your grant of rights with you. What would make them want to? They're splitting the revenue, so they're kind of screwing over these smaller schools in the ACC. What would make them agree to this?
The only thing I could think of is two reasons. I think they're trying to bet on their conference increasing its competition in the next few years. So by the
Okay.
time these guys are considering even thinking about leaving, the landscape is going to be different again. Because if you're
Mm,
kicking the can down to 2030, is when you said you'll get like that $75 million mark, which I think was kind of the magic number for a school like FSU to pony up and leave.
yeah.
Uh, if let's say like glass half full scenario, Miami becomes a real contender and makes college football playoff. Clemson stays at the top of the ACC and is a perennial playoff contender. Let's say Florida State gets their act together and Bill Belichick ends up staying around. And you have four teams that are flirting with the top 15 rankings year round. There is a chance that the ACC has a essentially a bargaining chip to say we're bringing some good competition. It's a hell of a lot less to worry about than the SEC and the Big Ten, where you have to make sure that you're one of the top four teams every single year to get a chance in what is kind of a murderer's row on a schedule. If you end up with the unfortunate luck of scheduling the top half of those conferences every single year. So I think there's a way to do that. And at the same time, if they're being strategic, they may realize that some of these overinflated conferences like the SEC and the Big Ten maybe bit off a little bit more than they can chew. So in
Ooh.
terms of getting some of these brands, what if USC and UCLA say, you know what, maybe we want to go over the ACC and go join Cal and Stanford? What
Okay.
if a couple of teams out of the SEC want to do the exact same thing instead of leaving the Big Ten? So I think for the ACC, they're trying to bet on themselves and say, well, the environment will be different. Is that realistic? I don't know, because it's all about your
It could be.
leadership. And we all know the ACC has not good leadership in terms of how that works. So
That's putting
I'm
it
just
very politically. That's putting it very nicely.
yeah. Well, we could say it sucks.
Yeah.
We call it the circle of suck for a reason.
Yeah. I can't. I mean, I want to be surprised, but I'm not. The ineptitude of ACC leadership, it just, there's one of two things that occurred, in my opinion. I think that either this quote unquote ironclad grant of rights clause that they had was not so ironclad, and that they may have been playing a metaphorical game of chicken and realized that they were going to go ahead and head on into a brick wall, which was FSU and Clemson, because realistically, FSU and Clemson have nothing to lose in this and only things to gain, whether it's the settlement they got now or whether it would be them getting out at an exorbitant rate. But either way, they would win in any case. And so something tells me that obviously you have defunct leadership, but on top of that, their argument probably wasn't as ironclad as they thought. And then on top of that, who's paying for the ACC? All the other programs, all the other schools. And I'm pretty sure when push came to shove, there were some presidents going, yeah, drop this. Yeah, drop this lawsuit, come to a settlement. And I think the bigger player in all of this, ESPN, also with a nice little prod, was like, hey, you're going to want to figure this out very quickly, because that February 25th, that 2025 date to re-up was coming up, and there had been mums and grumblings that something was going to come to it. I remember in late January hearing that, Clemson, I think we reported on it. We talked about how Clemson and the ACC and FSU had kind of picked up negotiation talks again. And so I think with that, ESPN kind of had nudged, some of the other presidents in the ACC and said, hey, if you know what's good for you, you're going to want to agree to this, and you're going to want to get Jim to kind of come down to settlement with FSU. So I think that's kind of what got us here because again, it I just I know you don't think so, but I really think FSU and Clemson, they got everything they wanted in this. I mean, we knew that they weren't going to leave to go to the ACC or Big Ten next year, or even in the next 3 years. But you give them 5 years, yeah, it's. I think it's an easy win for them. I wonder though, Rudy, is this a death sentence or is this a tactic to make some moves and to bide some time?
It's all about that leadership, right? I mean, it
Hmm.
could be a death sentence. It could be just a very slow, painful death for the ACC, but it's one of those where it should be a wake up call to them to say, look, what our value is here is the product that's on the field. And if we can make that as good as the other two major conferences, the SEC and the Big Ten, then they have a fighting chance. The only problem is we know how bad that leadership is. We know how bad that
Yeah,
competition committee and that officiating is. So there's nothing really, there at the moment. Now, if we start seeing some heads roll and there's like a new head of officiating that gets brought in, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot of major players now in these programs that have some influence, like Bill
yeah.
Belichick, for example, who likely will not pull any punches when it comes to what that looks like. So it'd be something to say. But you were talking about like, yeah, FSU and Clemson got everything they wanted, but now FSU has to get back to work and say, how do we rebuild this team? How do we rebuild this program? How do we rebuild ourselves? We've been hemorrhaging money between NIL that ended up being a bad bet, a construction that is ongoing at Woke Campbell that they're probably still going to have. I think hopefully they get finished before this 2025 season, but I don't think that's likely to happen.
I don't think
Uh,
it is either.
and it doesn't look like they really, retooled in any position specifically on their roster. So that 5 year, rolling number, it's if they don't get good quickly, they're not going to benefit from this.
Yeah, I think that was the biggest issue also with Florida State in particular, not so much Clemson because Clemson's been pretty consistent. But Florida State not having a landing spot. That's why I say they kind of win because this again, and the reason why I pose that question is because I genuinely think the ACC leadership made the settlement as a tactic to bide themselves sometimes in hopes that programs like Miami, like UNC, Florida State will renew that glory and get back into that competitive nature with the SEC and the Big Ten. But I call it a death sentence, and I pose that question because again, the Big 12, when they did that with Texas, well, look what happened. Texas left. I think there was another. I'm trying to think of
Hmm?
the other conference. Was it the AAC?
Pac-12 probably.
Or no, it wasn't the Pac-12. There was another conference. I forgot what it was, but they had also done uneven distribution sale, and then that conference fell apart basically. And well, if I say fall apart, I mean these conferences still exist, but not in the nature of what they were. And so I think
Probably
it's
like American or Conference USA, one of those
yeah.
two,
So
because
I think it's a slippery slope, right? It's kind of like like you've got your girlfriend upset with you. You guys are kind of on the rocks, and you go, okay, well, you can go flirt with whoever you want to go flirt with. You just don't sleep with them, right? And it's like, oh,
sure thing,
okay,
honey, sure
it's
thing.
like, yeah, sure, absolutely. I definitely will not go talk to the Big Ten or the SEC now that I know it's only going to cost me 75 million to get out. And oh, how funny is it that we agreed on that the fact that it's gonna the the landing spot will be 2030, which is exactly when the Big Ten has to renegotiate their media rights. And it's just a year prior to the college football playoffs and the SEC having to renegotiate their media rights, which something tells me, which I'm going to ask in a few minutes, that it's going to change the landscape of college football. So before we get to the overarching picture of college football, what does the ACC look like? What are your predictions for the ACC look like by 2030?
Uh, do you want my glass half full or glass half empty?
Give me both. Let's do both, man. We got time. We got time.
Uh, so the optimistic side says the ACC does enough to stay competitive by 2025, by what 2030, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Uh, Miami is perennially ranked in the top 10. Florida State is on its way back as a top 15 team. Clemson is kind of going from number one to maybe like number two or number three in the ACC. And North Carolina is doing okay. I don't think they're really going to just based on the splash that they've made this year, I don't know if it's going to be enough to make that team better. So I guess we'll see. Is the X's and O's really that much of a difference maker for them? I think that alone probably, and also the update, like given the increased participation with Notre Dame by having them play specifically the marquee teams in the ACC on
Right.
their schedule every year, I think might be enough to give them that chance because Notre Dame's not going to decline in value. So I think honestly, my theory that we talked about when this whole realignment started happening with those other conferences, I think we're going to see a lot of these major programs that moved into those two conferences decline in their value because they're not going to have the record consistent with what they were doing for the past 20, 30, 40 years. So I think there's going to be an opportunity for the ACC to establish themselves as still being a contender that way. Now, the worst case scenario
Let's go.
is
Give it to me.
it's full circle of suck. The officiating doesn't get any better. It's the worst, conference competition of the Power Three / Power Four. They get surpassed by the Big 12. They kind of already did, given Arizona State's success this year, but they
That's an
get
interesting take.
surpassed by the Big 12 as being a good option, and
Okay.
they're just kind of teetering on being a group of six at some point. And then teams start leaving like Miami, Florida State, and Clemson, and SMU, who just came in, and Stanford and Cal, because the same issue that they have is the same thing that like USC and UCLA have. They're sick of going cross country for what?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's look at it then this way then. What does college football look like in 2030?
So this is a good question, right? Because I think when I said this was good for college football, I like the idea of removing the power and the authority from the conferences because I think you had such a nepotism structure between these different conferences to where they shouldn't have that much of a say. So
Right.
the only thing that matters though is that they have two very competent leagues right now in the Big 10 and the SEC. How I think it's going to look in 2030 is I'm hoping that they scrap conferences altogether by that point in terms of what college football looks like. They have to give some concessions, whether it's using maybe like a legacy program by giving a cut to those, essentially what ESPN and the college football playoff as a brand has to do is they have to buy every major conference's piece of the puzzle out to say, look, we will funnel you a percentage of what those proceeds look like because you have to manage all of those other sports for these different programs. So for example, the Big 10 doesn't die, but Ohio State and Michigan and all of them, the football programs are under college football playoff. Basketball, baseball, volleyball, swimming, track, you name it, are still under that Big 10 umbrella. So I
Right.
think they need to have a way of saying, like, we will license your your teams to do this. We may historically keep the naming rights as Big 10 for a conference, but we need to just blow this entire super conference stuff up and go back to what we were talking about in terms of a classical reset by then. I think that makes sense because you can't have two people stack the deck. You're already talking about like the worst case scenario is creating multiple tiers of college football competition where you have like a Premier League that's
Right.
these two programs, but it's only a certain percentage of the country. And we know people are going to tune out after a certain point because that the new shiny thing only stays compelling for so long. If you alienate more of your market and you alienate more of your talent, it's not sustainable. So that's where I think it's going to go.
Yeah, I think it goes in one of two ways. And while I separated the question for you, I'll answer it together in the sense that I think if Miami stays consistent, I think if FSU can revive itself, Clemson remains consistent and still plays in, and Bill Belichick is able to build a powerhouse program at UNC. I think the ACC goes into 2030 with some real good bargaining chips because remember the grant of rights goes through 2036, but that's not to say that they can't re-up or renegotiate in 2030. When these programs get back. You also have to remember by that time, you will have had USC, all the former Pac 12 schools would have been in separate conferences for anywhere between 5 to 7 years, right? At that point. What is that looking like on their programs? Is the bump in what they're getting, plus the possibility of adding a Clemson, a Florida State, a Miami, a UNC, a Virginia, because Virginia has been a big thing, and Virginia and Virginia Tech are kind of locked together. And UNC and North Carolina State are kind of locked together as well. They have a traveling partner that goes with them. So when these big conferences start looking at each other and they see, okay, well, each respective conference, the SEC or the Big Ten, is going to naturally bring in 4 more programs. Yes, we may get an extra 2 or 3 million as a whole group, but what does that mean in terms? What's the overall if we're adding these people? Even if there's a partial, like they only get a half share for the first couple of years, but then it goes to full share. Will they still take that? I don't know, because you have to remember these West Coast schools are they have to factor in all these traveling, especially for all these auxiliary sports, your volleyballs, your baseballs, your basketballs. Is it going to be worth it? So I think if the ACC doesn't have that power cord and that they don't have that bargaining chip going into 2030, I think you really can possibly look at, the Pac-12 teams going their way. And then we're going to see a complete, like you were talking about, dismantling of football attached to the NCAA. I think at that point, you'll also have about 5 years of uneven distribution models where maybe FSU is killing it, or Miami, or insert maybe even SMU. Maybe this wasn't a fluke year, and the Pony Express starts riding again, and they're the SMU of the early '80s, dominant. Well, how long do you think Georgia looks at Vanderbilt getting the same amount of money for 5 years, knowing that SMU went from getting no money to making upwards of $75 million more than they had ever thought they were going to ever make over 5 years? You know what I mean? And again, you would adjust that for the Georgia or Bama model and those programs making, maybe it's to SMU it's 75, but to Georgia that could be 100 million they could be making. How long are they going to want to share that with Vandy? And I think if this uneven distribution model proves successful for these schools in the ACC, and by successful I mean they're getting maybe not the exact amount of money that the SEC is, but they're not lagging completely. They're not left in the Stone Ages like what we would be had they not done this. I just can't imagine the Ohio States, the Penn States, the Oregons, the premier programs allowing schools. I mean, and I'm not meaning this in a disrespectful way, just a matter of fact, programs like Purdue, Indiana, Vanderbilt, and Mississippi State getting the same amount of money. And I think at some point, when you get to this 2030 mark, these schools will be like, hey, why do we even need to do this? Let's just separate. We'll go back to everything. All other sports can go back to the original OG, Big 12. We'll Texas back in the Big 12. We'll put all the West Coast schools back in the Pac 12. You guys can have that for every other sport but college football. College football will do its own thing. And then they can now still renegotiate with Fox and ESPN. Hey, we're not going to call it the SEC. We're not going to call it the Big Ten, but Petiti will head up one side of the conference. Sankey can get Sankey, if he wants to be like, I'll just be the commissioner. We'll elevate, Tom York, if that, I think is his name, or Yard, what I don't know his name, the guy from the Big 12, move him up to the second conference, or even Phillip in the ACC, whoever it is, and then you create a whole other league. But I think we're seeing, and we had alluded to at the beginning of the season, we're at a precipice in college football where it's teeter-tottering. It's going to go either way. I think this ACC settlement is really going to be, we're going to look back in 10 years and be like, this was the moment that changed everything. This was when college football, I mean, like, just like in 5 years, we don't even need to do it in 5 years. We can do it now. But when the NIL came out a couple years ago and they announced they were going to do it, we knew like this is going to change the game. And sure enough, look what it's done. Right. And we're only in year one. We've only got 1 year under our belt of NIL, I think, or is it 2 years?
It's a couple. It's a few years, but yeah,
Okay.
it's
So
still
still in its
the rule has
infancy.
changed so much every single season too with the NIL piece.
So, I mean, you're looking at that. I mean, again, this is one of the first times a major conference is doing this uneven distribution, and the way that they're doing it, I think it's going to either allow the ACC to survive. Don't think so. Or it's going to completely dismantle conferences altogether, because again, I just can't. And Greg Sankey's been pushing, or he was pushing a couple of years ago, this book. I was listening to a podcast. Basically it was this, I think it was called The Cup or The Club. And basically the whole premise of the book was how the Premier League became the Premier League. And he was really pushing this model of how they did it and how they got the best clubs in the English soccer league. And they basically created a system that way. This is, I don't think you just read a book like that and you push it for just, hey, yeah, this is my reading. I'm a part of this reading book club. You know what I mean? So I think this is where a lot of people are moving to. We saw Project Rudy. We saw the college football, what was that, CBFL, whatever the heck it was called.
Yeah.
I think people are trying to like throw darts in that direction, and it's only a matter of time before someone hits the bullseye and it lands on that. And I think it's just inevitable now. I think with the ACC looking the way it does right now, I think this was a weak move by the ACC. I would have, if I were them, just fought it, see where it would have gone. I mean, at worst comes to worst, you drag it out for 2 extra years, you waste a couple $100 million on it. Great, but you're literally, your life is on the line. It was like I was watching another podcast. They're talking about the COVID vaccine, right? And they're like, "Well, what would you take?" They're like, "It's like, yeah, but we didn't know the things." He's like, "Well, you had two options at the time of the vaccine: you die, which a lot of people were doing, or you risk possibly growing a finger out of your forehead in 9 years." You know what I mean? It's like, what would you want? It's like, well, obviously, I'd rather have a finger growing out of my head in 10 years as a chance, possibly, than dying. That's basically what the ACC said. The ACC should have just fought it off and been like, listen, I'm going to die either way if I don't fight this. Why not fight it? So we're gonna have to wait and see what happens. Hopefully FSU can get their stuff together, get this league up and running. If not, yeah, I just can't imagine FSU and Clemson sticking around much longer.
I just look at it as you look, you're bringing in some great talent. Miami got Carson Beck out of the portal. You got a guy that knows what that competition's supposed to look like. You've got a defense that's supposed to be retooled. Get up and get going, because the more you win, the more you're in the driver's seat, especially when it comes to all these programs. If you're winning and you're successful, that's what matters more than anything else. You have to win your games.
Yeah, and here's the craziest part too. There's a curveball coming in April with the Supreme Court decision. I
Yep.
mean, that could throw a wrench in all of this that we're talking about, and could drastically change what everyone's doing. And I think that's what a lot of people are waiting on too. And so again, there's just so many. I think everyone is kind of just on a balancing wire right now, waiting to see where everything is going to fall, and it's going to be very interesting.